stripped of everything, seeing his family murdered, his empire burned to the ground. He became a stateless refugee, a ghost of an unimaginable fortune. He lost everything. And then the regimes of Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini offered him everything back, a throne, a kingdom, a crown. He refused. His name was Prince Roman Petrovich. How, in a world ravaged by war, could a penniless man refuse a kingdom because the hands that bestowed it were tainted with cruelty? His life began on October 17th, 1896, at the very heart of that grand illusion, Peterhof Palace. This was never just a house. It was the Russian Versailles, a vast universe of golden fountains, Baroque palaces, and manicured gardens outside St. Petersburg. It was the absolute pinnacle of imperial power, a world built to amaze, to show strength, a world built to last forever. But he was born into its twilight. He was a Romanov, but of a very special and influential branch, the Nikolaevichs. His grandfather was Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, a tall, stern military figure who was the son of Tsar Nicholas I. This made Roman the great-grandson of a Tsar, placing him high in the imperial hierarchy. His father was Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich, a quiet, erudite, somewhat frail man who preferred architecture and art to court politics. But it was his mother, Princess Milica of Montenegro, who brought a different, wilder energy to the family. Milica and her younger sister Anastasia were known at court as the Montenegrin Ravens, or Black Danger. They were the daughters of King Nicholas III of Montenegro, a small, proud Balkan nation. Sent to Russia to study at the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, Milica and Stana never really fit in. Instead, they brought a mix of social ambition and a strong interest in mysticism. In a court that was increasingly becoming desperate as its foundations cracked, their influence was enormous. The court of Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra Feodorovna was a place of suffocating fear and superstition. The Empress, a believer in mysticism, desperately sought a miracle to cure her son, Cesarevich Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia. Milica and Stana filled that void. They held seances introducing charlatan seers and healers one after another into the royal circle. They were the first to introduce a French healer named Philippe of Lyon, who gained considerable influence within the Tsarist household before being exposed as a fraud. But their most important act, one that would shake the empire to its foundations, took place in 1905. It was Milica and Stana who discovered Grigory Rasputin, a mysterious peasant from Siberia. They believed him to be a true holy man, a man with divine healing powers. They introduced him to Empress Alexandra. This act, born of a mixture of sincere faith, political naivete, and personal ambition, opened the door to the man who would become a symbol of the corruption and downfall of the entire dynasty. Although Milica and Stana later broke with Rasputin, realizing his dark nature, it was too late. The demon had been unleashed. This was the atmosphere Roman grew up in. On one side was the rigid, orthodox military tradition of his father and grandfather. On the other, a swirling fog of mysticism, necromancy, and impending dread. He and his twin sisters, Marina and Nadezhda, grew up in unimaginable wealth, dividing their time between the formal splendor of Peterhof and a far more mystical retreat, the Dolber Palace in Crimea. Dolber was unlike any other royal palace. It was a stunning white Moorish revival fortress, a fantasy of Arabian palaces, designed by Roman's own father, Grand Duke Peter. This was an important detail. Peter, an engineer at heart, designed it not just for beauty, but for defense. He designed thick walls, strategic defenses, and a defensible perimeter. It was a palace built by a man who, unconsciously, was preparing for a siege. It was here that Roman spent much of his childhood, and it was here that the core contrast of his character took shape. He was surrounded by hysteria. His mother and aunt were trying to communicate with the dead, while the royal court was collapsing because of the prophecies of a mad priest. But Roman was different. He was described as reserved, serious, and deeply dutiful. He did not inherit his mother's love of the occult. He inherited his father's practical, structured mind. He was not interested in seances. He was interested in how things worked. Roman had a gift for engineering and science, a sense of logic and order in a family, and a world that were increasingly lacking. Both he was educated at home, as was the tradition for Grand Dukes before being sent to the prestigious Nicholas Cavalry School. This was the standard Romanov path, but Roman took a different path. Instead of simply pursuing a military career in an elite guard regiment, he was drawn to a more demanding discipline. He enrolled at the Nicholas Technical Academy in St. Petersburg. This choice says it all. He was not a flashy cavalryman. He was a builder, an engineer. He was a man of structure, of logic. Born of mystic parents in an empire disintegrating from within by irrationality. As a prince of the Nikolai line, he held a senior but not direct role in the line of succession. He was a prince of the imperial blood, a symbol of continuity. He was one of the last of the Romanov elite born in Imperial Russia, a living link to a past that, in 1896, seemed unshakable. He attended family councils and major royal events, watching his father advise Tsar Nicholas II. He was close to power but not consumed by it, which allowed him to be a keen observer. He enjoyed the leisure pursuits of the aristocracy of the age, hunting, travel, and socializing with European royal families, to whom he was related through both Russian and Montenegrin blood. He was a privileged young man, floating on the calm surface of a volcano, unaware of the magma bubbling beneath his feet. Then the world burned. In 1914, World War I began. For the Romanovs, it was a call to duty, the ultimate expression of their bond with the Russian people. A wave of patriotic fervor swept the empire. Roman, then 18, was not sheltered from it. He remained in Kiev at the Technical Academy, but now his studies had an urgent, deadly purpose. He was no longer studying for the future. He was studying for the present. In 1916, at the height of the war, Roman graduated. He was not assigned to a safe ceremonial post in St. Petersburg. He was sent straight to the firing line. He was commissioned and enlisted in the Caucasian Engineer Regiment and sent to the Ottoman front. This is an important and often overlooked detail. This was not the main glorious front against Germany. This was a brutal, grueling, and often forgotten theater of war in the Caucasus. It was a war of harsh terrain, treacherous mountains, and brutal winters. It was a war of logistics, of survival against the elements as well as the enemy. And Roman's job as a newly minted engineer, he didn't lead cavalry charges, he dug. As a sapper, his work was the science of war. He built fortifications, he mapped out trenches, he calculated the angles of artillery fire, he built pontoon bridges under fire and repaired damaged railways. He served bravely facing enemy fire while carrying out his engineering work and earned the respect of his men for his courage and ability. More importantly to his story, he saw the truth. He had seen the rotting of the imperial war machine from within. He had seen soldiers sent to the front without rifles, without ammunition, without proper boots. He had witnessed the dire shortages of supplies, the chaos of logistics, and the crumbling morale of an army being asked to die for an empire that could no longer feed or arm them. His engineering mind would see this clearly. This was not a failure of spirit, it was a failure of system. The machine was broken, the gears were no longer working together. Roman, the loyal prince, stood in the mud of the Caucasus front, and he knew with cold mathematical certainty that everything was falling apart. He was at the front, doing his job, when the news from the capital, by then renamed Petrograd, turned from bad to apocalyptic. In February 1917, it happened. Revolution broke out, not from a German attack, but from within. Starving people, striking workers, and mutinous soldiers flooded the streets. The unthinkable had happened. Tsar Nicholas II, his cousin and anointed king, had abdicated. In a matter of days, 300 years of Romanov rule had vanished. Prince Roman was just 20 years old. The monarchy was gone. The world he had been trained to serve, the system that had given his life meaning, no longer existed. Prince Roman's chain of command, indeed his entire nation, had disintegrated overnight. The Tsar was gone. The new provisional government, a chaotic coalition of Democrats and moderate socialists, was trying to run a collapsing country while continuing the war. For a soldier at the front, it was a logistical nightmare. Orders were conflicting, supplies were running low, and the already fragile morale of the army was shattered. Roman, a 20-year-old engineer, must find his way home. He travels through a country in convulsions, where loyalties change hourly. He is no longer an imperial commander. He is an aristocratic wanderer, a symbol of the now hated old regime. Like many Romanovs, his family believed the turmoil was temporary. They sought refuge, retreating to the only safe place they knew, Crimea. The Black Sea Peninsula had long been a royal playground, a Russian riviera of opulent palaces and villas nestled along the shore. Roman's family, along with his grandfather, Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, a former commander-in-chief of the Russian army, gathered at the Dolber Palace. Dolber, the white Moorish fortress his father had built, was now their oasis. They tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. They drank tea on balconies overlooking the Black Sea, strolled in the gardens, and wrote anxious letters, convincing themselves that order would soon be restored. In the summer of 1917, they lived in a strange limbo. They were under house arrest by the provisional government. It was an insult, but not a mortal threat. They were guarded by soldiers, but the soldiers still showed a certain respect. The atmosphere was tense, but not yet terror. Roman, with his practical mind, perhaps saw the rift more clearly than his elders. He saw how the local soldiers looked at them, not with reverence, but with simmering resentment. Then in October 1917, the ground collapsed completely. The Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, overthrew the provisional government in an armed coup in Petrograd. The news spread like a seismic wave to Crimea. Their comfortable house arrest was gone. Their provisional government protectors were gone, replaced by local Bolsheviks. And the Yalta Soviet, the local Bolshevik council, was not like the Petrograd intelligentsia. It was largely made up of radical sailors from the Black Sea Fleet who had a deep and personal hatred for the aristocracy that had used Crimea as their playground. For the Yalta Soviet, having a group of Romanov Grand Dukes on their doorstep was a gift. It was an opportunity to dispense people's justice at once. The danger was no longer abstract. It had become tangible and immediate. The atmosphere at Dolber changed from anxiety to outright fear. They were now real prisoners, trapped in their own fortress, surrounded by an angry mob crying for their blood. It was here that the design of Grand Duke Peter, Roman's father, came to their rescue. Dolber had been built like a fortress. The outer walls were thick and high. The windows were strategically placed. The palace was defensible. The Romanovs inside, including Roman, his grandfather, his parents, and several other family members, gathered. They were protected by a small group of loyal soldiers and officers who had chosen to stay with them. The Yalta Soviet was running out of patience. A local political commissar, a man named Zadorozhny, decided to act. He gathered a group of Bolshevik sailors and Red Guard soldiers with the clear intention of storming the palace and massacring everyone. Inside the siege began. The Romanovs could hear the angry mob outside the walls, the shouts, the threats, and the occasional gunshot. They were trapped. Roman, the 21-year-old engineer, was now in a situation that logic and science could not resolve. It was pure absurdity, a mob driven by hatred trying to break down his door to kill him simply because of his blood. They prepared for the worst. They waited for days, listening to the chaotic negotiations between their small protectors and the Bolshevik commissars. And then a strange salvation came, not from mercy, but from the Bolshevik bureaucracy. While the local Yalta Soviet wanted to kill them immediately, the Sevastopol Soviet, a larger and more organized body, intervened. They were not acting out of compassion. They were acting out of jurisdiction. Sevastopol argued that the fate of such high-ranking prisoners was a matter for the central government in Moscow, not for a Yalta mob to decide. A dispute broke out between the two Soviets, a battle for power and control. This bureaucratic wrangling saved their lives. While Yalta and Sevastopol argued, time passed. The Yalta Soviet was forced to retreat. The siege was immediately lifted, but the danger was not. The Romanovs remained prisoners, their fate hanging by the thin thread of revolutionary bureaucracy. They lived in this fearful limbo for weeks, which turned into months. And then, in one of history's most ironic twists, their enemy became their savior. In March 1918, Lenin's Bolshevik government, desperate to escape World War I and consolidate its power, signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. It ceded large swaths of the former empire, including Ukraine. Under the terms of the treaty, German troops were allowed to occupy Crimea. In April 1918, the German army entered the peninsula. For the local Bolsheviks, it was a disaster. For the Romanovs imprisoned at Dolber, it was an unbelievable miracle. The Kaiser's soldiers, the enemies the Romanovs had fought on the Caucasus front only a year earlier, were now their liberators. The German officials, still a monarchical and orderly force, were horrified by the prospect of senior royals being lynched by a Bolshevik mob. They quickly marched on Dolber and took control. The Bolshevik Red Guards disintegrated before the disciplined German forces. The Romanovs were free. But it was a strange, humiliating freedom. They were protected by the occupying armies of their country's old enemies. They could leave Dolber's walls, but where could they go? Russia was no longer theirs. It was during this fragile period of protection that the truly terrible news began to arrive. These were no longer rumors of riots in Petrograd. These were news of systematic destruction. In July 1918, they received news. Roman's cousin, the former Tsar Nicholas II, his wife, Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and the young Cesarevich Alexei, had been murdered. There was no trial. They were brutally executed in a cellar in Yekaterinburg. The entire family, including the youngest son, a hemophiliac, had been shot, bayoneted, and their bodies destroyed with acid and fire. To Roman, the logical man, the engineer, this was incomprehensible. It was a breakdown of all reason. This was not war. It was ritual murder. And it didn't stop there. The news kept coming. Other cousins and uncles in Alapayevsk, another group of Romanovs, including Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich and Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, were beaten and thrown alive into an abandoned mine shaft with grenades thrown after them. Roman at 21, had to face the fact that his family was being hunted down and exterminated like animals. This was not a political revolution, it was a purge. The grief they felt must have been terrible, a toxic mix of personal grief and the terrifying realization that their world was not just over, but systematically erased. The German defense was a temporary delay, not a solution, and that delay ended in November 1918. Germany, defeated on the Western Front, signed the armistice. Its own empire collapsed. The German army in Crimea began to disintegrate and retreat. The power vacuum was immediately filled with chaos. The nightmare was back, this time worse. The Russian Civil War was at its height. Crimea became a fiercely contested battleground between the Bolshevik Red Army and the anti-Bolshevik White Army. For the next several months, the Romanov family lived in a dangerous limbo, moving between white-controlled areas as the Red Army closed in. They knew that if they were captured, they would have no chance of survival. They were living symbols of the old regime, and the Red Army would not make the mistake of letting them live again. By the spring of 1919, the situation was desperate. The Whites were collapsing in Crimea. The Reds were at the gates. The only way out was the sea. This is where the central figure of the evacuation comes in. Roman's grandmother, the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna. She was a small, intimidating woman, sister of Queen Alexandra of England, and mother of the murdered Tsar Nicholas II. Despite the fact, she steadfastly refused to believe that her son and grandchildren were dead, believing them to be Bolshevik lies. She was at Yalta, and she symbolized everything. Her nephew, King George V of England, was extremely concerned for her safety. He was criticized for not acting quickly enough to save his cousin, Tsar Nicholas. He would not let his Aunt Maria suffer the same fate. He ordered the Royal Navy to do its bidding. In April 1919, a British warship, the mighty HMS Marlborough, dropped anchor in Yalta Harbor, its mission to rescue the Queen Mother. But Maria Feodorovna would not make things easy. She displayed an iron will, a royal arrogance that ultimately saved not only her life but also the lives of others. She declared that she would not leave unless all Russians who wanted to leave with her, including the remaining Romanov family, and hundreds of aristocratic refugees, were also taken on board. British officers, worried about Bolshevik shells falling on the harbor, begged her to hurry. She ignored them. She calmly conducted an evacuation as if it were a royal picnic. The scene on the docks must have been chaotic and tragic. Europe's richest and most powerful families were now desperate refugees, jostling for space on foreign warships, carrying whatever belongings they could, suitcases, jewelry boxes, and their beloved dogs. Prince Roman, then 22, was among them, along with his parents and sisters. He was one of the last senior Romanovs to leave Russia. He stepped onto the bridge of HMS Marlborough. It was not an act of victory. It was a surrender. As he stood on the deck of the ironclad, he looked out. He saw the mountains of Crimea where Dolber Palace stood, their last refuge. He saw the shores of his homeland. As the ship weighed anchor and the roar of its steam engines began, he watched it fade into the mist. He would never see it again. It was the final end of Imperial Russia. For Roman, it was the end of everything he had ever known. He had survived the massacre of his family. He had survived the sieges. He had survived the Civil War. He was alive. But his life was over. Their journey took them to Constantinople, Turkey. The ancient city was filled with tens of thousands of desperate white refugees, just like them. Grand dukes and princesses were selling their last jewels in the streets for food. It was a world turned upside down. From Constantinople, the Roman family moved, eventually finding refuge in France. They were not welcome guests. They were burdens, living reminders of a dead world order. The exile has begun. Exile was a strange, surreal dream. For a man like Roman, raised in the splendor of Peterhof and the safety of Dolber, the new reality was stark and harsh. The Romanovs landed in the south of France on the glamorous French Riviera. They settled at Cap d'Antibes, a place that would become the melancholy capital of the Russian diaspora. This is the great paradox of the whites. They are surrounded by sunshine, palm trees, and the richest people in the world, yet they are completely broke. They lived by selling what they had managed to smuggle out of Russia. The jewels, the diamonds, emeralds, and pearls, once worn at the Winter Palace balls, were now sold discreetly, piece by piece, to pay rent and buy food. Prince Roman, the engineer, the man of practical skills, now had to adapt to a life without purpose, a life defined entirely by what he had lost. He saw other Grand Dukes who had commanded regiments now driving taxis in Paris. He saw princesses who had dominated St. Petersburg society now working as seamstresses or fashion models. It was a degradation on a massive scale, and it required a different kind of strength to survive. But in this chaos, Roman found an anchor. On November 16, 1921, at Cap d'Antibes, he married Countess Praskovia Dmitrievna Sheremeteva. She too was in exile, descended from one of Russia's oldest and most prestigious aristocratic families. Their wedding was a ghost of an imperial affair, attended by lost nobles dressed in their last working suits. It was not a political alliance or a dynastic arrangement. It was a union of two survivors, two souls who understood the depth of each other's loss. Praskovia provided the emotional stability he craved. She was his companion in this strange new life. A year later, in 1922, their first son was born, Prince Nicholas Romanovich. In 1926, their second son, Prince Dmitry Romanovich, was born. These two boys represented the future, but it was a future without a nation. They were princes without a principality, heirs to a throne that had been smashed and buried in an unmarked grave. Roman focused on his family. He lived modestly, a ghost on the Riviera. He dabbled in small businesses, tried to use his engineering mind where he could, but he was essentially out of step with the times. He lived in a community haunted by the past. The Russian exiles had built a Little Russia in France, with their own Orthodox churches, schools, and military institutions, all based on the illusion that one day Bolshevism would collapse and they would return in glory. But Roman, with his realistic nature, seemed less affected by this illusion than the others. He saw the collapse from within. He knew the machine was broken beyond repair. He watched as the emigre community around him fractured. And this is where the first major controversy of his exile took place, a controversy that would shape the rest of his life and legacy. In the wounded and fragmented Romanov community, a big question arose: who was in charge? Who was now the head of the dynasty? Long after the assassination of Tsar Nicholas II, many, including the Empress Dowager Maria Feodorovna, refused to believe that he was dead. But as the brutal reality began to sink in, a power struggle began. In 1924, Roman's cousin, Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, made a bold and controversial move. From his exile, he declared himself emperor and ruler of all Russia, Tsar Kirill I. This action tore apart the Romanov community. Kirill had his reasons. He was the most senior male survivor of the dynasty, but his claim was met with fierce opposition, with Prince Roman and his father, Grand Duke Peter, among the most vocal opponents. Their opposition was not based on personal ambition. It was based on something Roman held above all else: principle and law. First, There was the issue of Kirill's loyalty. During the February Revolution, Kirill commanded the Naval Guards Regiment in Petrograd. Instead of defending the Tsar, he led his regiment to the Tauride Palace to swear allegiance to the provisional government, even wearing a red revolutionary ribbon on his uniform. For staunch royalists like Roman and his father, this was an unforgivable act of betrayal. He had broken his oath of allegiance to the Tsar's second, and more legally important was the issue that Kirill's mother, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, was a Lutheran, and she did not convert to Russian Orthodoxy upon marriage, which was required by dynastic law for those in the direct line of succession. Although she later converted, the legality of this remains in doubt. But the core issue for Roman and the Nikolaivichi branch of the family was a deeper philosophical one. They believed that, according to Russian fundamental law, the monarchy had ceased to exist when Tsar Nicholas II and Cesarevich Alexei died. It could not be restored by an individual claiming to be in exile. Only the Russian people on Russian soil, through a great council like the one that elected the first Romanov to the throne in 1613, could restore the monarchy. For Roman, Kirill's self-proclaimed Tsar was a usurpation, a political farce. It was an attempt to seize an illusory crown. Thus Prince Roman, his father Peter, and his grandfather Nicholas Nikolaevich flatly refused to recognize Kirill. They became the leaders of the non-predeterminist faction within the émigré community. They were pure legalists. This stance is crucial to understanding Roman's character. He was a tough guy. He was not an opportunist. If the rules were broken, you couldn't just make new rules to suit you. He would rather have no czar than a fake czar. This stance isolated him. It pushed him into the political wilderness of the émigré community, where Kirill's supporters and those who did not argue bitterly in Parisian cafes and Riviera villas. But Roman remained steadfast. He focused on his family, on raising his sons. He and his family eventually moved to Italy, settling in Rome. They lived in a country now under the control of a new type of authoritarian rule, Benito Mussolini's fascism. Roman lived the life of an Italian gentleman, but he never stopped being Russian. He raised his sons to speak Russian, to be Russian Orthodox, and to understand the weight of their names. He meticulously archived family history documents, wrote memoirs, and preserved the memory of a world that, for others, had been lost to history. He was the embodiment of the white experience, a life suspended in cultural space, forever mourning an irretrievable past and forever barred from the future. He was a prince without a country, a soldier without an army, an engineer with nothing to build. And then, just as he had settled into this tragic but stable life of exile, the world fell apart again. A new, darker, more terrible storm was gathering in Europe. As the gloomy 1930s faded into the 1940s, a new, more terrible storm was brewing. Prince Roman and his family lived in Rome, an ancient city now the capital of a rising neo-fascist empire. Benito Mussolini's black shirts paraded through the streets, and the shadow of his ally to the north, Adolf Hitler, loomed over the continent. For the Russian diaspora, the 1930s were a decade of bitter disillusionment. Bolshevik Russia did not seem to be collapsing. It was consolidating, transforming into Stalin's Soviet Union, a monstrous state even more oppressive than they had imagined. Hopes of a quick return were dead. In its place was a weariness, a prolonged existence in limbo. And then Hitler came. The rise of Nazi Germany presented the whites with a monstrous moral dilemma. Their enemy was Bolshevism, an irreconcilable enemy, one that had killed their families, taken their lands, and destroyed their world. And now a powerful, dynamic leader in Germany was openly declaring his intention to destroy Bolshevism once and for all. For many émigrés, their hatred of Stalin outweighed anything else. They began to see Hitler, in their despair, as a crude weapon, a devil with whom they could compromise to expel another demon. Some, like Cossack leaders and far-right ideologues, actively sought alliances with the Nazis. They believed they could ride the tiger, that a German invasion of Russia would be a liberation, and that they could be brought back to power afterward. Others were deeply confused. They were torn between love for Russia and hatred for the regime that had usurped it. And then there are people like Prince Roman. For a man of logic and principle like him, there is no confusion. Fascism and Nazism are not a solution. They are just another form of the same disease. They are another tyranny, another ideology based on violence, hatred, and a cult of personality. For Roman, replacing Stalin with Hitler is like replacing the bubonic plague with cholera. Both are enemies of the civilization he represents. His family lived quietly in Rome, trying to stay out of sight. But they couldn't. They were the Romanovs, and in Europe's ruthless new game of power, that name made them pawns. The Nazis and the Italian fascists had a special and entirely opportunistic interest in Europe's lost aristocracy. They were not monarchists, they despised heritage and old laws, but they were ruthless pragmatists. They understood the value of legitimacy, or at least appearance of legitimacy. When they conquered countries, they sought collaborators. Installing a puppet king, a local prince, or a respected noble in power would make the occupation look like a protection or restoration. It would appease the local population and provide a familiar cover for their brutal rule. They actively searched through the lists of nobles, even going so far as to manipulate Almanac of Gotha, the genealogical yearbook of European royal families. In 1943, change the genealogical rules to legitimize some lines and eliminate others for their political purposes. And Prince Roman Petrovich was a perfect candidate for this kind of exploitation. He lived right in Rome, within reach of Mussolini, and most importantly, he had bloodline. In April 1941, the Axis war machine swung into action in the Balkans. Germany, Italy, and their allies invaded the kingdom of Yugoslavia. The war ended quickly. The Yugoslav army was overwhelmed and disintegrated. The country was carved up as spoils of war. The young King Peter II of Yugoslavia fled to London. In this division, a new nation was created from the rubble, the Kingdom of Montenegro. This was the homeland of Roman's mother, Princess Milika. It was the kingdom of his maternal grandfather, King Nicholas I. But the Italians, who had been granted Montenegro as their protector, had a problem. They needed a king, a puppet king, but a king nonetheless. The immediate heir to the Montenegrin throne, Prince Michael, was in custody. They offered him the throne he flatly refused, and for his defiance he was arrested and imprisoned in a German prison. So the Italians looked for the next person on the list, and they found Prince Roman Petrovich, who was living right in Rome. He was the perfect man. He was the grandson of the last king. He had Romanov blood, which gave him prestige. He was under their control. Surely, they thought, this man, a penniless exile who had lost everything, would seize this opportunity. It was not a vague offer. It was a formal, specific proposal. It was unclear who made it, a well-dressed Italian diplomat, a fascist official, or a German officer. But the message was clear and unmistakable. We are restoring the kingdom of Montenegro. We want Serbe king. This was the final test. This was the moment his entire life had led to. Consider the temptation. Roman was not a monk. He was a dethroned prince. He had lived nearly 25 years in exile, living off his scraps and memories. He had lost his palace, his lands, his country, and almost his entire family. And now he was offered a return, not just any return, a throne, a kingdom, a palace, a purpose, a chance to restore his status, to become what he was born to be. All he had to do was say yes. All he had to do was nod. All he had to do was sign his name on a document, shake hands with men in uniform, and become a puppet of Mussolini and Hitler. This is not a fanciful claim in a Paris cafe like the Kirill controversy. This is a crown, really protected by the two most powerful armies in Europe. They could put him on the throne tomorrow. His son Nicholas later recalled the family's attitude during this period. They absolutely hated Mussolini. They despised the Nazis. For Prince Roman, this was not a political calculation. It was a moral judgment. And he refused. He refused firmly without hesitation. This decision is the key to understanding his whole life. It was not a spontaneous act. It was the inevitable result of his character. First, and most importantly, his legitimacy. This was the man who refused to recognize Grand Duke Kirill because Kirill had violated the rules of succession and had betrayed his oath. If he could not accept a Romanov fake, how could he accept a crown given to him by foreign invaders? A king, in the Roman view, derived his power from law, tradition, and the consent of his people. This Montenegrin crown did not come from nowhere. It was a stage decoration created by an occupying invader. Accepting it would be a violation of every principle he had defended in his dispute with Kirill. It would make him a hypocrite of the highest order. Second, there was the moral objection. Roman was not a naive political thinker. He knew exactly what Nazis and fascists were. They were tyrants. They were murderers. They represented everything his old, orderly, civilized world hated. He would not be a puppet czar for a regime he saw as fundamentally evil. He would rather be an anonymous exile than a collaborator king. Third, there was a complicated patriotism. A few months after this offer, in June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union for Roman. This was a terrible truth. Russia, his homeland, though ruled by the Bolsheviks he hated, was now being invaded by a foreign tyrant. He couldn't accept a crown from a man who was preparing to massacre millions of his own people. Many émigrés had chosen that path, joining the German army, hoping to liberate Russia. Roman didn't. His patriotism, his loyalty to Russia, the land, the people, the history, was deeper than his hatred of Bolshevism. He would not betray Russia by allying with its worst enemy. Finally, there was his allegiance to Montenegro. He was the grandson of King Nicholas I. He would not accept his grandfather's throne from the Italian invaders, who had imposed themselves on the Montenegrins by force. To accept it would be a betrayal of his mother's legacy as well as his father's. So he said no. We cannot underestimate the danger of this decision. This was not about turning down a dinner invitation. This was about saying no to Benito Mussolini inside Mussolini's Italy at the height of Axis power. In an instant, the Roman prince had turned from a potential asset into a useless nuisance. And in a despotic regime, a useless nuisance quickly becomes a menace. The consequences were immediate and terrifying. The family were not arrested and shot. The Nazis were too busy fighting a world war, but they were effectively prisoners. They were under constant surveillance. The secret police watched their every move. Their phones were tapped. They couldn't leave Rome. They were trapped. Roman, the engineer, the logical man, had made a decision that was completely illogical in terms of survival, but completely morally justified. They lived the remaining years of the war in this state of fearful limbo. They witnessed the devastation of war that echoed the losses of the Russian Revolution. They endured bombing raids, food shortages, and constant fear. Then in 1943, Italy collapsed. Mussolini was overthrown. But relief did not come. German troops immediately occupied Rome. Now their former guardians were the direct rulers, and they were far more ruthless. The Romanov family, who had openly rejected the Axis, were now firmly in the hands of the Nazis. They survived those final brutal years of the war somehow, by luck, stealth, and perhaps the general chaos of Germany's collapse. When the Allies finally liberated Rome in June 1944, the Romanov family was free, but it was an empty freedom. Roman had won his personal battle. He had kept his soul. He had not compromised. But the price was the final confirmation of his fate. The world was saved from fascism, but victory was won by the Allied powers, one of which was Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The result of the war was that his homeland was now locked behind an iron curtain. It was more powerful than ever, and it was the irreconcilable enemy of everything he stood for. His great moral decision, his resolute defense of his honor, was the very act that closed the last door to his homeland. He had done the right thing, and for that, he was condemned to eternal exile. The liberation of Rome in 1944 was no victory for Prince Roman Petrovich. It was a cruelly ironic truth. The enemy who had murdered his family, Joseph Stalin, was now the West's great ally. The greatest moral decision of his life, rejecting Hitler, had become a sentence, slamming the door to his homeland shut forever. His final decades in Rome were a long twilight. He was no longer a political pawn, he was a living relic. Trapped between two enemy ideologies, he abandoned all ambition. His entire energy now focused on a single project, his two sons Nicholas and Dmitri. He did not raise them to be czars. He raised them to be bearers of memory. He turned his home into a living archive, teaching them Russian, orthodoxy, and most importantly, the lesson of refusal. He explained why he rejected Kirill and why he refused a throne from Hitler. He taught them how to be worthy of the Romanov name, not how to reclaim it. He died quietly in Rome in 1978, an exile. It seemed like the end, but it wasn't. His sons took up the torch. They founded the Romanov Family Association, an organization built on exactly his principles, non-political, focused on family unity, and trusting that only the Russian people could decide their future. And then the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Now the true legacy of Roman's wartime decision became clear. As the new Russia looked for the Romanovs, they found Kirill's heirs making political demands. And they found Roman's sons, a clean lineage. Roman's decision to say no to Hitler, in a nation that lost 27 million people to the Nazis, was everything it had given his son something no crown could offer: unquestionable moral authority. The climax was the 1998 funeral of Tsar Nicholas II. While others boycotted over disputes, Nicholas and Dmitri returned. They did not come as claimants to a throne. They came as nephews burying their murdered relatives, as Russians returning to heal. In that historic moment, as President Yeltsin stood and said, "We are all guilty," the man standing in the front row, as the most senior and respected representative of the entire Romanov family, was Prince Nicholas, Roman's son. It was the ultimate vindication. If Roman had said yes to Hitler, his sons would be cursed as the sons of a traitor. But because he said no, because he chose honor over power, he had built an unbreakable moral bridge. He, the engineer, had given his sons the key, not to a palace, but to the door back home.